If you were the Grand Maharajas of the Earth, what policies would you enact to try to prevent the coming collapse of civilization? I think the best solution would be diversification and as much of it as possible. You probably want to encourage interstellar colonization, if that's even possible in the first instance, because at least then you can vary up your genetic variety among populations. And maybe instead of having one population at one point in time that's going through a period of civilizational zenith, you can have a whole bunch of populations which will always be at one point or another in their cycles. And hopefully if you aggregate across a large enough number of them, you'll end up with at least one that's going to be producing something that looks like a civilization at any time. But we've always had that in the history of mankind. We've always had at one point it was China, at one point it was Islam, at one point it was the West. Yes, but I'm thinking of taking out the temporal aspect of this, because these populations have always been temporally separated from one another. So you've always had these dark ages, in which nobody's gotten anywhere, and there's been no advancements at all anywhere. One group has always had to do all the heavy lifting essentially, whether it's Chinese or Europeans or Arabs. There's always been one group that when it reached its pinnacle, it has had to do all the heavy lifting. So what you want is to encourage as many different human experiments, to use Ray Cattle's term. He was fond of this idea that cultural groups could be looked at as experiments. But the problem with your plan is that it's contingent on being able to reach a sufficiently high level of intelligence to do intergalactic travel. Well, interstellar travel is much less of an onerous task than intergalactic travel. Fortunately, we don't need intergalactic travel in order to colonize stars in the nearby stellar volume. And there's plenty of prospectively habitable worlds out there. Hang on, can we even get to Mars? I don't think we will in this cycle, but in the next cycle maybe. Because one of the things you see with these cycles is they peak at different levels. So the Romans got to a certain level, they weren't quite at the industrial level, they were almost there, they had the elements of it like steam power, although it had very limited uses in ancient Greece that was restricted to opening and closing doors on religious shrines. Or little toys that span around because of little nozzles sticking out of them. I disagree that the next cycle will be higher. What about the fact that we've been very lucky in this cycle? We've had the Black Death that was very lucky, because it wiped out 40% of people in the European population, the less intelligent 40%. We had this very cold period, even colder than they experienced in the previous cycle. A number of factors that are unlikely to replicate. Well, there you have it. Fermi's paradox solved. You heard it here first, folks. The dysgenic phase of the civilizational cycle is just replicated across civilizations, across the universe, and nobody ever gets to a point at which they can do all the Star Trek stuff. Actually, I already have been working on a rather novel solution to Fermi's paradox. The Fermi paradox I believe solvable with two observations. One is that the social epistous amplification model makes it so that civilizations never actually can scale to the point at which you can have the requisite amount of social complexity to actually do these amazing things. Things like becoming a Kardashev of one civilization, putting older orbital habitats around the sun, so it englobes it essentially, and you end up with this Dyson swarm that can just soak all the energy out of the sun, and therefore use up the total energy output of the sun. This is a Kardashev of one civilization. You don't really need to go to other star systems to be able to increase the amount of living space within our immediate stellar volume by quadrillions of times. This huge amounts of space in the volume of the solar system, it's absolutely huge. You could have quadrillions and quadrillions of people living in just the volume of the solar system alone. So basically the question is, why don't we ever get there? The answer to that is because social complexity, present mutations, was such a huge target that they just break down these complex social formations, preventing them from being able to scale to the point they can actually maintain a civilization at scale. So the very nature of our social bonding and social binding is such that the more of it there is, and the more elaborated it is, the more easy it is to undermine through mutations, which are very good at taking those bonds out. The other thing I've pointed out before, which is somewhat controversial, is an observation which was made by a group of astrophysicists about 15 years ago. They did a sky survey of about 2 or 3 million stars, which fell within a narrow range of star types that our particular star falls into. So they took about 2.5 million of these stars, and they looked at the light coming off of these stars. And what they found was that the light in a very tiny subset of these, around 200 or so, was modulated. And this was published in a serious astrophysics journal, so it was a very big deal actually when it came out. It made a lot of news. But what they found was the light was modulated, and when you did a Fourier transformation on the light, you got a signal out of it. And they speculated that the modulation pattern in the light is artificial. They actually suggested it wasn't natural, but it was produced by a large orbital structure like a stellar, a star-powered laser, which is basically just two mirrors with a hole in one end. It's a very easy thing to build actually. It's not beyond our current capabilities to do. You just need big mirrors and put them in orbit around the star. And have the light band surround and focus it into a coherent beam and modulate it, and hey presto, you've got a beacon you can use to signal between stars. And they found, yes, in a tiny, tiny percentage of stars, apparently there were these laser-like emissions pointed at us, and they reasoned that this might actually be advanced civilization. So they might actually have found ET. It's just these ET are stuck in their own cycle. They are subject to the same dysgenic pressures that we are, and the same social epistatic pressures. There's reasons to believe that the other alien life may be convergently evolved with respect to us, because there might be a very limited range of evolutionary trajectories that you can take to get to a point at which you can be a highly culture-using, tool-using type intelligence. So this idea of aliens being completely random looking is nonsense. Simon Conway Morris and other people have argued that if anything they'd look a lot like us. And if they're convergent on us with cultures, well then they're going to be just as screwed over as we are. We might be seeing beacons of dead civilizations that are stuck in their own cycles of time just as we are. And nobody ever gets out there, and nobody ever does any colonization. The same problems that are limiting us are also limiting these other civilizations. The closest one of these is about 400 light years away, so if it is an intelligence that has fallen, then it's an intelligence which will be in a very primitive state indeed.